Welcome back to Houston Life. KPRC2 is teaming up with the Galveston Bay Estuary Program to raise awareness about their efforts to protect our local bays, bayous, and estuaries for future generations. From Houston to Galveston, they work closely with local organizations on important initiatives.
Yeah, and today we are meeting a Clear Lake restaurant owner who, along with the help of the Galveston Bay Foundation, is working hard to help restore Galveston Bay's natural habitat by recycling oyster shells. Since 1994, Tommy's Restaurant and Oyster Bar has been a local favorite in Clear Lake. In 2001, the restaurant's owner, Tom Tollett, had an idea. He enlisted the help of the Galveston Bay Foundation to start a movement that would restore local waterways by recycling oyster shells.
The Galveston Bay Foundation is a conservation organization. Our mission is pretty straightforward: to preserve and protect the natural resource of Galveston Bay. We do habitat restoration, we do land conservation, we do water protection work. We are trying to restore habitat that has been lost in the past. So we've lost a lot of wetlands in Galveston Bay. We've lost a lot of oyster reef in Galveston Bay. And so our oyster shell recycling program fits right into the habitat restoration.
People don't call you Tommy?
Yes.
And I can tell you love that, right?
It's fine. It's fine.
So Tommy's your namesake.
We were Tommy's Seafood Steakhouse at one time, Tommy's Patio Cafe at one time. Now we're Tommy's Restaurant Oyster Bar. That happened back in 2011. Which was great about that is that we really went back to my roots, which is I love seafood. I'm originally from Louisiana, southern Louisiana. And oysters and fresh seafood have always been what I have enjoyed learning about and serving, mainly because not only do we want to educate the public about oysters, but we also have a great respect for what oysters do for our bay.
When you and Bob first met, do you remember that conversation and what you were feeling at the time as a restaurant owner, taking these oyster shells that could be used in other ways and just throwing them in the trash? That had to have been frustrating for you.
I was determined to figure out a way to solve that problem.
Tom basically came to me and said, I've got this idea of like starting this organization that's going to work on the health of Galveston Bay. And I said, Tom, that's who we are and what we do. And he said, I have this seafood restaurant. We're serving a lot of oysters. We're throwing away all the shell. Is there something an organization like the Galveston Bay Foundation can do with that shell? And I said, absolutely, we can collect that shell and ultimately put it back into the bay where it would serve as a home for baby oysters. We literally started a conversation probably in this room 14 years ago, and then we had to sort of figure out how to collect the shell, where to store it, and how often it needed to be collected. And Tom was very patient with us because collecting oyster shell in Houston, particularly in the summertime, can be a pretty nasty business.
Why is it a nasty business in the summers, Bob?
Yeah,
what do you mean?
There's some pieces of oyster left in the oyster shell, it turns out. Maybe some sauce, maybe some horseradish. We wanted to make sure, all the oyster shells that we collect from restaurants, we do it in a way where it's a safe thing, a healthy thing for the restaurant. But we had to learn that process at the very beginning of this whole project.
It sounds like there was a lot of trial and error involved. Were there other places in America or around the world where you could sort of learn from them? Because it sounds like you really had to kind of figure it out on your own.
For me personally, I didn't know that there was until later we started to research and determined that East Coast has been doing it for years, places on the West Coast as well. So it has been done. I just didn't know about it, but it certainly worked itself out. And so we got to use some of their models.
Did you set out to be an environmentalist?
Probably not, but I certainly feel like my heart and soul is there now.
Again, Tom was the start of the program, which now we collect oyster shell at over 39 area Houston restaurants.
Today, more than 200 tons of oyster shells are collected from area restaurants each year. They are then left to cure in the sun for at least 6 months before being returned to the bay, helping to create a new habitat for future oysters.
And the reason it's important to put the shell back in the bay is because oysters float, little baby oysters, little microscopic oysters float around the water in Galveston Bay at certain times of year, and they're looking for a hard surface to attach to grow into a baby oyster. And the best place for that is an oyster shell itself. I mean, that's how reefs grow.
I understand that prior to this program's existence, the population of oysters in the bay were on kind of a steady decline.
Well, Ike took out 70% of all the reefs in Galveston Bay. The surge brought in so much silt that covered over the reefs, and that's what killed them. So then we've been steadily rebuilding those reefs over the years. And our great oystermen have been saving oysters and doing the same thing.
The marine ecosystem is so complex to begin with. What you both are doing, along with an army of people, you're helping to protect our shoreline as well.
Yeah, I would say that oyster reefs and oyster shells are so important for so many reasons. They filter water. They're important because they provide habitat and relief, so the fish love to hang out in and around the oyster reefs because the little baby fish are there and the big fish eat the little baby fish, and then we go catch the big fish. And then they also provide shoreline protection. Oysters will trip waves and slow down any surge that might be coming, and so there's so many reasons why you want a healthy oyster population in Galveston Bay.
What's your message to people out there who, oyster fan or not? I mean, we all are so close to these waterways.
Yeah, so my message would be to, be curious about where your food's coming from in the first place. This is sort of a farm-to-table issue. The oysters that we have in front of us today are from Galveston Bay. And then to ask the restaurateur, perhaps, what are you doing with the shell after we finish using it? Are you recycling the shell? Could you be recycling the shell? So, just have a sense of, not only where your food comes from, but also where the waste might go. And in this case, these shells can be used to create new oyster reef.
Restaurant owners, by the way, you pretty much have it laid out for them.
It's really very easy. It couldn't be any more simpler. What do they get in return? They get oysters in return because we can perpetuate our oyster supply.
You're essentially preserving the supply chain
Yes.
of oysters while at the same time helping to clean up the waterways.
Absolutely.
At Tommy's restaurant, you'll find a map highlighting bays along the Texas Gulf Coast, each one giving oysters a distinct, unique flavor. While some restaurants fly in oysters from around the country, Tom chooses to keep it close to home.
Well, you're shipping rocks from one side of the country to the other, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But, I think our oysters they're the greatest oysters. They have a great flavor. Our bays are cleaner because of them. So there's multiple reasons why we should.
I could have talked to these guys for an hour, I swear, and they were telling me it did take a bit of trial and error to figure out this process for collecting the shells. How long do they dry out in the sun? So we're going to answer some of those questions because still ahead, we're going to take you to that undisclosed location where we're going to learn more about how it is all done. And in the meantime, to learn more about the Galveston Bay Foundation and their oyster shell recycling program, you can visit galvbay.org/oysters. By the way, ask your local restaurants what they do with their oyster shells. I have started doing this, and a lot of them will say, oh, we just throw them in the trash. But if you go to places like Blue Dorn, they are part of this program. No cost to the restaurants. Someone comes and they collect, well, it's Shannon. she's going to come and collect your shells from this container, haul them off. They do all of the work. So spread the word. Next time you go to a restaurant, ask them about it.
That's such a good practice.